Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Bren. Very happy to have you here. Now, I've made a few videos of this kind, talking about 10 essential books from a particular publisher in my library that I just can't do without. And the response to those videos has been pretty good. So I'm going to carry on because I want to make videos that people enjoy engaging with. I've got here 10 essential Faber and Faber books from my library that I'm going to discuss with you today. Faber and Faber is a British publisher of quite high renown and sort of intellectual and poetic rigor. They have a very stellar and rich history of publishing some of the most influential poets, but also novelists, many of whom are British poets, but also from other places in the world. Like in the other videos in this series, which I will link above, whether it was discussing 10 essential Penguin classics, 10 essential Dover thrift editions, 10 essential vintage classics. The idea is that these books are not necessarily my all-time most beloved, cherished, favorite books, but are books that if I had to contract my library enormously, I probably couldn't do without these. They have shown me parts of myself that I didn't know existed. They have generated new paradigms and perspectives and have added tonal variance to my inner life, and for that reason they are essential. So without further ado, let's dive into these 10. First, I've got W.H. Auden, Poems, 1930. Now, Auden is one of those kind of writers who was very prolific over a long period of time and wrote and published dozens and dozens of books. And one of those poets who I think became quite overtly political. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but it doesn't always work. It's quite a fine tightrope to walk between producing spontaneous brilliance through your artistic medium and also, you know, bringing a political element without it becoming too mechanical or too forced. And I think Auden's early work has a kind of obtuse sparkle and mysterious magnificence to it. But his later work, he was a bit long-winded. He tended to kind of waffle and pontificate a little too much for my own taste. This is his first collection, and it has a kind of strange mystique to it. It has an opacity that is very alluring, if confounding at times. And I think in that sense we could compare him to Dylan Thomas, who was quite misunderstood when he burst onto the scene with his rippling imagistic flair. I think if you're familiar with Dylan Thomas, it's an interesting comparison to make. And I will give you an example of what I mean. Of a hawk's vertical stooping from the sky, these tears, salt for a disobedient dream, the lunatic agitation of the sea. And there is a kind of oceanic, operatic agitation to these lines of verse that are always flowing and rippling and breathing in and out of reach, like in a tidal fluidity that is quite hard to grasp hold of. And with that kind of poetry, I would say, you know, just immerse yourself in it. Take a plunge into the waves and currents of Auden's voice, what the American poet Terence Hayes calls the slippery atmospherics of voice. That is the best way to enjoy a poet that has a kind of abstruse, serpentine quality to the lyricism, and that is the case with Auden. But this first collection is very memorable. I found myself often walking some street, or in Auden's words, walking dully along and thinking about salt for a disobedient dream, this strange image sort of haunting me at moments when I least expect it. Then I've got Djuna Barnes, Nightwood. This is a novel from 1936. Djuna Barnes is one of the lesser-known modernist writers of the Paris intelligentsia of the 1920s and 30s, but I think it's a disservice that she is lesser known. She was actually quite a prolific journalist of American origin who made her way over to Paris and rubbed shoulders with Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and the like. But Djuna Barnes, she doesn't get the credit she deserves, and Nightwood is the centerpiece of her body of work. It is gloomy chiaroscuro of shadow and light, night and day, illicit love and desire, the brutal wounding of forbidden love and forbidden desire. There is a real homoerotic energy that is suppressed and bursting through at times, and there are, in the kind of dark avenues of the backstreets of Paris, this lingering sense of unfulfillment and of crushed dreams and of disillusionment, and that all sounds very heavy, but there's a kind of sumptuousness, velveteen, brazen refusal to be obliterated by the social pressures of the day and to find clandestine means of making contact with others and finding like-minded people. And the characters are careworn and beleaguered, but her immortalizing of them through this work brings into the light of the literary tradition people, characters, feelings, identities, modes of expression, modes of affect that had hitherto not seen the light of day. And Djuna Barnes mesmerizingly evokes that nightlife of Paris in the 1920s. This Faber and Faber edition has a preface by T.S. Eliot, and he was a massive champion of Djuna Barnes' work. We're going to look at T.S. Eliot in a moment, actually. And he actually worked for Faber and Faber. He was one of the key figures to recruit and sign the manuscripts of these kind of writers. So he did a wonderful job in promoting, in championing the work of Djuna Barnes. So then we have T.S. Eliot. 4 quartets I've chosen here. I've got all of his work in my collection in various editions, although almost all of it is published by Faber. And this one was first published in 1944, 4 quartets. It's Eliot in a mature stage of his work. He has made his name 20 years before as one of the kind of high priests of modernism, with Proof Rock and Other Observations, and The Wasteland, of course. 4 Quartets is Eliot more mature, more self-assured, perhaps a little bit less hungry, less to prove, but yet still as incisive as ever. There is a real intermingling here of philosophical, phenomenological insight and lyrical freewheeling. It's not easy poetry, but it is my favorite work of T.S. Eliot's. And like I said with Auden, there's some very memorable lines here that I think one should revel in rather than trying to paraphrase them into some kind of neat meaning. I will read you a little bit here. Of course, classic Eliot. He's got a epigraph here from Heraclitus in Greek. Yeah, you know, at times annoyingly erudite, a bit showy in his learnedness. And the end and the beginning were always there, before the beginning and after the end. And all is always now. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still. Shrieking voices, scolding, mocking, or merely chattering, always assail them. The word in the desert is most attacked by voices of temptation, the crying shadow in the funeral dance, the loud lament of the disconsolate chimera. And caught in the form of limitation between unbeing and being. So it is very philosophically sort of rigorous in its registers. We've got here ontology with the ideas of being and unbeing, phenomenology of time, metaphysics of time. And this is Eliot trying to reconcile his piety of his religious belief with his artistic principles. Then I've got 2 here from Sylvia Plath. I've got The Bell Jar and Ariel. Again, Faber just delivering the goods. Plath, as many of you know, was an American writer, very precocious, who tragically took her life when she was in her early 30s, just before the publication of Ariel. And The Bell Jar is her only novel that she published, and she actually published it anonymously or under a pseudonym. But of course now we know that it is the work of Sylvia Plath. And it's a pretty dire, depressive, damp and stormy novel with a kind of doomed, deterministic feeling to it. But it's But Sylvia Plath is a writer that's had a massive influence on me, and to have her only novel in the beautiful Faber edition is certainly an essential for me. And yeah, it's a work that has a bit of a tinge of adolescence to it, in my opinion. Maybe that's a bit of a controversial take. It's not a masterpiece of fiction, but what I really love Sylvia Plath for is Plath's second book of poems, her first being The Colossus, which I've also got in the Faber. But I think Ariel is probably my favorite collection of her work. This beautiful old Foxed edition. She tragically took her own life in 1963 and was survived by her two children. She had this controversial relationship with the English poet Ted Hughes, who was also published in Faber. And I do have some of his work here, but he pales in comparison to Sylvia Plath. In my opinion, there is a kind of dark, magisterial illumination of lyrical power to her poems that were very, very influential in my own journey as a young writer. And the publication of my first book, I think, would possibly never have happened if I hadn't have discovered and been spellbound by Sylvia Plath, and particularly the poems in Ariel. This poem is particularly chilling, The Rival, when we know a bit of context about her relationship, her very stormy, tumultuous relationship with Ted Hughes, and his subsequent leaving her and forming a relationship with another woman who, horrifyingly enough, also killed herself. The Rival, if the moon smiled, she would resemble you. You leave the same impression of something beautiful but annihilating. Both of you are great light borrowers. Her own mouth grieves at the world, yours is unaffected. And your first gift is making stone out of everything, dying to say something unanswerable. And I think that, in a way, Sylvia Plath's poetry is unanswerable. You can't summarize it into some glib, happy conclusion, something beautiful but annihilating. I think that speaks to the unstoppable force of Plath's poetry. Then I've got two books here by Philip Larkin, a very different poet to Sylvia Plath, but a poet who has, again, also impacted me tremendously. And I've got High Windows. Now, Larkin did not publish an awful lot of poetry in his lifetime, only 4 mature collections. The North Ship, which is not really him at his strongest, and certainly not him in the timbre of his idiosyncratic and unforgettable Philip Larkin voice. And then The Less Deceived, The Whitsun Weddings, and then High Windows. So it's 4 collections, one of which is relatively immature by his high standards. But High Windows is him in full maturity, in the full flourish of his rather curmudgeonly, grouchy, but sublimely gifted and economical and understated lyric genius, whether consciously or sort of inadvertently. He was a spokesman for the kind of middle-brow English culture, the average working person who was just sort of trying to get by week to week, paying the mortgage, and working in some kind of uninspiring office job. Larkin himself worked all his career as a librarian, and writes very brilliantly about his relationship to work. And here is an excerpt of his poem, Money. I listen to money singing. It's like looking down from long French windows at a provincial town. The slums, the canal, the churches ornate and mad in the evening sun. It is intensely sad. And yeah, there is a way in which he takes that provincialism, let's say, and makes it radiate something timeless and drags it out of the mire of being sort of snottily dismissed as inconsequential. He knows how to tap into the simpler, humbler aspects of English culture and illuminate them really beautifully. But he was also, I think, at his best, capable of expressing the deft, sensitive, and moving articulation of impending death. And High Windows, which is the eponymous poem of this collection ends with, "Rather than words comes the thought of high windows, the sun comprehending glass, and beyond it the deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless." Right, let's move along. Now, this for me, and I talk about this on my channel quite a bit, about the importance of moving between text and context. There is, I suppose, a kind of fashionable type of literary theory in which, who cares about the author? It's all about sort of interrogating and deconstructing the text to find some hidden biases or some hidden unconscious meaning. That kind of reading or interpretation has its place, but I think true lovers of literature and of literary tradition, and I think when you read writers on literature, when writers talk or write about the books they love and the literature they love, they really are sort of all-inclusive in their knowledge of the writers that have influenced them. And that is something that I try to aspire to. So it's not just about being able to do a kind of racy, post-structural reading of, Philip Larkin's sort of unconscious biases. Yeah, that has, of course, a small part of, the body of critical work around any influential writer, but also he was just a fallible, contradictory human, and I think a rich understanding of his work, or any writer's primary material, is to read context and to read their non-fiction, to read their memoirs. And letters are one of the most powerful literary forms because there is a rawness, kind of churn and glitter of raw thought, to borrow an expression from the Irish poet Nick Laird. That is what you get in diaries and letters, and this massive compendium of the collected letters that Philip Larkin wrote to his lover Monica Jones is very revealing, very vulnerable and implicating, and multifaceted, multi-headed beast of cattiness, of intimacy, of depth, of feeling, of hopes and fears. And it's really what I found so intensely moving about this collection is that it spans, almost a whole life. They met when they were in their early 20s and started a relationship that was not always steady, it was not always smooth, it was a mismatch of sort of romantic aims, and Larkin did not always treat her well. We don't have her side of the case, but there's also a lot of tenderness and just a lifetime of shared linguistic and emotional connection. And yeah, we get snippets of his own reading and writing processes, but also very much just his fear of growing old and his struggles with the drudgery of work and his doubts and anxieties and confusions. And she, in the end, sort of won him over, and as towards the end of their lives, they were both not in the best of health, and she ended up moving in with him, which was something that he resisted for a long time. Read into that what you may. His lack of commitment to her, the fact that he actually had, relationships with other women, of which she was aware, I believe. She may have had relationships with other people too, but certainly this is not a book about sort of proving that Philip Larkin, can dismiss his detractors. He had his flaws just like any of us do. Sometimes he could be really nasty, but yeah, this is not a call to sort of deify him or something like that. It's just very interesting to understand his poetry, and therefore it is a Faber and Faber essential. I've got 1979's Fieldwork by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney, and Heaney was a Nobel Prize winner, and in fact Faber and Faber had a pretty good run of Nobel Prize winners, because T.S. Eliot was also a Nobel Prize winner, as is Seamus Heaney, and Derek Walcott also won the Nobel Prize. We're going to get to him in a second. Seamus Heaney, Fieldwork. This is Heaney at his soaring exaltation, in which he takes the kind of seemingly parochial, backwater linguistic utterances of small town Irish desolation and solitude, and really invigorates that language and turns it into musically searing poems that express such a tumult of feeling and bodily sensation and sensory aliveness. Derek Walcott got the Arkansas Testament. Walcott was St. Lucian poet, so St. Lucia is an island in the Caribbean. This book is actually dedicated to Seamus Heaney. And Walcott has a magisterial flow and vigor to his poetry, images that sear into your psyche and remain there forever. He was very much engaged in the kind of clash and conflict of empire and the influence of Western colonization on the global South, and in particular on Caribbean cultures. But he didn't reject English. He kind of used it, reappropriated the English language for his own musical lyric poetry, and he, even though these poems are in the lyric form, they are personal, they are sort of capturing the ephemeral and transient moments of feeling and emotion. At the same time, they have a kind of historical sweep to them, broad historical range of perspective and kind of scything, cutting, but also dancing and rejoicing in this crucible of cultures that is St. Lucia and is the Caribbean, an ecology of linguistic variance and profusion blended together into very singular and effective poetry. Then finally, Faber did this series called Faber Finds, and this is Ian Hamilton in search of J.D. Salinger. This is a slanted, smirky, playful, but also investigative and searching account of J.D. Salinger's life. But this book got really caught up in a maelstrom of controversy because J.D. Salinger actually sued Ian Hamilton for using quotes from letters that Salinger had not given his consent to. And it went all the way through the American legal system to quite high up. And Salinger actually won the case, and Ian Hamilton, who was, sort of a fairly young writer at that time, had to basically overhaul his whole manuscript and paraphrase and rework his material in order to fulfill his obligation with his publishing deal. And this is a book in which he takes that material, but then also brings in his experience of researching his subject and his experience of going through this legal wrangle. And it's a surprisingly funny and touching and playful book that I think does a lot better than other work that I've read on Salinger. It has an honest engagement with Salinger's texts, and it's, I think, part of what helps, a part of the success of this book is that Ian Hamilton was himself a talented writer. He published books of poems and fiction and also criticism, and you see that he knows his craft and brings that to bear on his exegesis of J.D. Salinger's life and work in a very memorable and sort of rambunctious way. And that is my list of 10 essential Faber and Faber books from my library. So as always, please let me know what you think of these. How many of these have you read? What did you think of them? Do you have much in the way of Faber and Faber in your library, and how valuable are those books to you? I would love to hear from you. Also, if you have other writers or books or subjects in mind that you would like to see me make videos about, then please do let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Your input is very valuable to me in how I proceed with making videos on this channel. So yeah, thanks very much for watching, and until next time.